in the sprawling, sun-dappled hills of Provence. The sound of lute music mingled with the laughter of noblewomen as Margaret of Provence gazed out upon the bustling courtyard of her family's estate. She was but a girl, yet the weight of destiny already hovered over her like a shadow, ever present, but unnoticed. The year was 1234, and the streets of Provence were alive with rumors, whispers of a powerful match to be made, a union between the House of Savoy and the noble line of France. She had no way of knowing that the moment her father, the Count of Provence, had pledged her hand in marriage to the young and idealistic King Louis IX of France, her life would be forever intertwined with the fate of one of the most revered monarchs in history. Margaret's story begins in a land full of tumultuous power struggles and familial ambition, where even the smallest of decisions would have far-reaching consequences. Born to Raymond Berenger IV, Count of Provence, and Beatrice of Savoy, Margaret was no stranger to the burdens of nobility. Yet, for all the fine silks and golden crowns, it was the quiet and seemingly insignificant moments that would shape her into the woman whose name would echo through history. In the heart of Provence, where the lavender fields stretched as far as the eye could see and the sun bathed the land in golden hues, a young Margaret of Provence was born to Raymond Berenger IV, Count of Provence, and Beatrice of Savoy. The year was 1221, a time of both grandeur and uncertainty for the noble families of Europe. Provence was a region of great beauty, but also one caught between the tensions of shifting political alliances and the ambitions of more powerful kingdoms. For the young Margaret, the palace at Aix-en-Provence was a world of elegant courtly customs, lavish banquets, and sparkling jewels. Her early childhood was marked by the lessons of grace, refinement, and chivalric ideals that her tutors instilled in her. As a daughter of the Count of Provence, she was expected to embody the virtues of nobility, to be poised, learned, and capable of managing her father's estates with ease. Margaret's childhood was not unlike that of many noble women, filled with the beauty of youth, yet shadowed by the ever-present realities of politics. Provence, though prosperous, was also a region constantly vying for greater influence. The House of Berenger, to which Margaret belonged, was known for its territorial ambition, but it lacked the power of more established dynasties such as the Capetians of France. Her father, Raymond Berenger IV, was an ambitious man. His marriage to Beatrice of Savoy had cemented his alliance with the House of Savoy, a powerful dynasty that would play a pivotal role in shaping Margaret's future. It was in this politically charged environment that Margaret learned the importance of alliances, diplomacy, and, above all, the art of marriage. By the time Margaret was 8 years old, her parents had already begun to consider her marriage prospects. The position of a noblewoman, especially one as beautiful and accomplished as Margaret, was often determined by the political strategy of her family. But Margaret was different. Despite the intrigues of the court and the expectations placed on her as a noblewoman, she was known for her inquisitive nature. She loved to listen to the stories of her mother's court, the great history of France and Savoy, and the distant lands beyond the mountains. It was here, amidst the fragrance of roses and the glitter of jewels, that Margaret's destiny began to take shape. In 1232, when Margaret was just 11 years old, her father received a letter from King Louis VIII of France, a letter that would change Margaret's life forever. The king, upon hearing of the beauty and grace of the young Countess of Provence, had set his sights on her as a potential bride for his son, the future Louis IX. At the time, the French monarchy was embroiled in internal struggles and the looming specter of external threats. King Louis VIII was determined to secure an alliance with Provence, a region that could help fortify France's southern borders. To this end, Margaret's hand in marriage was a highly strategic move, one that would cement ties between the Capetian dynasty and the House of Provence. Margaret, still so young, had heard stories of Louis VIII and his powerful kingdom. She knew little of the man who would one day be her husband, but she knew that the match was of great importance. For the first time, She was made aware of her role not only as a daughter of the Count of Provence, but also as a pawn in the game of dynastic politics. While Margaret's parents were elated by the prospect of an alliance with France, they were also cautious. Margaret's mother, Beatrice of Savoy, had seen firsthand the intricacies of royal marriages and the delicate balance of power that such unions required. She was determined that her daughter would not only be a political tool but a woman of strength in her own right. Margaret's lessons became more intense. She was taught the languages of the court, the arts of diplomacy, and the complex rituals of royal life. She was also taught how to handle herself with grace in a world where beauty and intelligence were often overshadowed by power and influence. The prospect of marrying Louis IX was now a reality. The political arrangements were quickly formalized, and it was decided that Margaret would be married to the young prince in 1234. Margaret, despite her youthful age, understood the significance of the marriage, both for her family and for the kingdom. She would become the Queen of France, a role that came with its own expectations, responsibilities, and dangers. As the marriage loomed closer, Margaret found herself torn between excitement and fear. She had heard stories of the king's devotion to religion and his piety, and while she admired him for his virtue, she had little idea what it meant to be married to such a man. Would he be a distant figure, absorbed in his religious duties? Or would he be the caring and loving husband she had always dreamed of? The uncertainty lingered in her heart, and yet, Margaret knew that her fate was now sealed. She was no longer just the daughter of Raymond Berenger IV. She was the future Queen of France. On the eve of her departure for the French court, Margaret stood before her mirror, gazing at the reflection of the young woman she was about to become. Her mother had insisted that she wear her finest gown, a rich blue silk adorned with pearls, and a crown of roses woven into her long, dark hair. As she stared at her reflection, she wondered what awaited her in the distant land of France. Her thoughts drifted to the stories of the French court, the intrigues, the beauty, the power. Yet, beneath it all, there was something she could not quite grasp. The truth was, Margaret had never truly known what it meant to be a queen. She had been trained for it, certainly, but the reality of it was still foreign to her. As Margaret made her way to the docks, she was joined by her family. Her father, Raymond Berenger IV, was a man of few words, but his pride in his daughter was evident. His alliances with the French monarchy had ensured that his family would be remembered for generations, and Margaret's marriage to Louis IX would seal his legacy. Her mother, Beatrice of Savoy, looked at Margaret with a mixture of love and concern. She had seen her daughter grow from a girl into a young woman, but she knew the challenges that lay ahead. Beatrice had spent years navigating the treacherous waters of royal politics, and she feared that Margaret's innocence would make her vulnerable to those who would use her for their own purposes. The journey to France was long and arduous, but Margaret did not mind. She was filled with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness, wondering what the French court would be like and what kind of man Louis IX truly was. She spent her time in quiet reflection, contemplating her future and praying that she would be able to fulfill the expectations placed upon her. Upon arriving in France, Margaret was greeted with pomp and ceremony. The French court was magnificent, its wealth and grandeur a far cry from the more modest estates of Provence. She was introduced to the young Louis IX, who was kind and respectful but somewhat reserved. He was the embodiment of religious devotion, and Margaret could see that his faith was his guiding force in life. He was deeply committed to his people and to the idea of kingship, but Margaret also noticed that there was a certain distance between them. Louis was not a man who sought affection or approval from others. He was a man driven by duty, piety, and the notion of Christian kingship. Their marriage took place in 1234, in a grand ceremony that united two of the most important families in Europe. Margaret, now Queen of France, stepped into a role that would forever change her life. The future was uncertain, and she had no way of knowing that the next few decades would test her faith, her strength, and her resolve in ways she could never have imagined. But one thing was clear: Margaret was now a part of something much larger than herself. She was a queen, and the fate of France, and perhaps even Europe, would rest in her hands. The year was 1234 when Margaret first set foot on the soil of France, a foreign land that would soon become her home. She arrived in the capital, Paris, with a mixture of anticipation and unease, not fully understanding the intricacies of her new life. The French court was unlike anything she had ever known. Vast, filled with the hum of power and intrigue, and yet, for all its splendor, it seemed strangely distant. Her marriage to Louis IX, while politically significant, was not one founded on the fires of passionate love, but on duty and the shared ambition of two powerful houses. At the grand ceremony in Notre Dame, with the soaring spires above and the scent of incense filling the air, Margaret was crowned Queen of France. She stood beside her husband, Louis IX, the young prince who had been raised to embody the very ideals of chivalry and piety. Though he was still just a boy, he was already known throughout France for his unshakable devotion to God and his future role as a monarch who would lead with divine purpose. In the eyes of the French people, Louis was a king not only of land, but of faith. He would be remembered as one of France's greatest monarchs. Margaret, at just 13 years old, was thrust into this formidable legacy. Her coronation was not just a celebration of marriage, but a symbol of the political union between the House of Provence and the Capetians, two families whose fates were now intertwined. Margaret had heard stories of the grandeur of French royal life, but it was not until she saw it firsthand that she realized the extent to which she was now a part of something much greater than herself. The halls of the royal palace in Paris echoed with the whispers of power. Courtiers, ambassadors, and nobles alike all circled like vultures around the newly crowned queen, their eyes filled with the promise of influence. For Margaret, every step she took in the court, every word she spoke, was laden with consequence. Her marriage was not just a personal journey. It was a strategic alliance that had the potential to shape the future of Europe. But she was also aware that, despite her royal title, she was still very much a young girl, naive in the ways of power, yet destined to learn its harsh realities. Louis IX, though deeply pious and committed to his duties, was a stranger to his bride. Their marriage, at least in the early days, was more ceremonial than intimate. The young king was focused on his duties, his faith, and his studies of the Christian faith. He spent long hours in prayer, seeking guidance from God on matters of state and governance. Margaret, for her part, tried to immerse herself in the royal duties expected of her. She spent her days at court, learning the rituals of the French monarchy and gaining a deeper understanding of the politics that surrounded her. Though Louis IX was often distant, his character revealed itself through the quiet moments they shared. Margaret could see that he was not a man of grand gestures, but one of deep integrity. His devotion to his people and to God was unquestionable, and over time, Margaret came to respect him for these qualities. Still, there was a distance between them, both physical and emotional, that Margaret could not bridge. She was young, and Louis, though her husband, seemed more a figure of reverence than a companion. As the months passed, Margaret began to settle into her role as queen consort. She bore her new responsibilities with grace, managing the royal court and supporting Louis in his various campaigns. But her life was far from easy. Behind the grandeur of the court, there were constant challenges, political rivals, courtiers seeking favor, and nobles eager to exploit her position for their own gain constantly surrounded her. Margaret quickly learned the delicate balance of maintaining her dignity while navigating the treacherous waters of French politics. One of the first major challenges Margaret faced as queen was the issue of the Crusades. Louis IX, who had grown up in a devout household, was deeply moved by the idea of waging a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. In 1244, only a decade after their marriage, Louis IX made the fateful decision to embark on the Seventh Crusade. For Margaret, the news was a bitter pill to swallow, though she had always understood that her marriage was a political alliance. The prospect of her husband leaving for distant lands left her fearful and uncertain about the future. She was just a young queen, barely in her 20s, and already she was faced with the daunting task of holding the French court together in her husband's absence. Louis, however, was resolute in his decision to lead the crusade, and Margaret, though reluctant, supported him. She knew that her role as queen required her to stand by her husband, no matter the cost. The separation was painful, and as Louis left for the Holy Land, Margaret was left to rule in his stead. The weight of the crown was now on her shoulders, and she realized that her influence as queen would be tested in ways she had never imagined. While Louis IX was away, Margaret worked tirelessly to maintain the stability of the French kingdom. She managed affairs of state, attended to the needs of the court, and oversaw the administration of the royal finances. It was a demanding role, but Margaret rose to the challenge. She proved herself to be a shrewd and capable ruler, earning the respect of her subjects and the admiration of her court. But the stress of her position took its toll. Margaret was often lonely, missing the companionship of her husband and the stability that his presence brought. She also faced the constant pressure of living up to the expectations placed on her as queen. The court looked to her for guidance, but Margaret's heart often longed for the quieter days in Provence, before the weight of the crown had been placed upon her. Despite her inner turmoil, Margaret remained strong. She knew that her duty as queen was not just a title, but a responsibility that demanded sacrifice. In her letters to Louis, she expressed both her love for him and her concerns about the kingdom's welfare in his absence. She urged him to be cautious in his crusade, knowing that the road ahead would be fraught with danger. Louis IX, for his part, continued to communicate with his queen during his time on the crusade. He wrote to her frequently, seeking her counsel and offering her reassurances. His letters were filled with religious devotion, reflecting his belief that the crusade was a divine mission. He spoke of his hopes for victory, but also of the hardships they faced on the journey. Margaret read these letters with a mixture of pride and worry. She knew that Louis was deeply committed to his faith, but she also feared for his safety. As the crusade dragged on, Margaret's concerns grew. The journey was long and grueling, and the French forces faced numerous setbacks. Despite Louis IX's piety and dedication, the crusade ultimately failed to achieve its goals. Louis was captured in Egypt, and for a time, it seemed as though the fate of the crusade and of Louis himself was uncertain. The news of Louis's capture sent shockwaves through the French court. Margaret was devastated, but she did not falter. She rallied her supporters, taking swift action to ensure that the French kingdom remained stable. She sent emissaries to negotiate her husband's release, and while the terms were harsh, Louis was eventually freed. When he returned to France, he was a changed man, his faith even more profound than before. The years following Louis's return from the crusade were marked by a new sense of unity in their marriage. Margaret had proven herself to be a capable queen, and Louis had come to see her not just as his queen consort, but as a partner in his reign. Their relationship, though initially distant, had grown stronger through the trials they faced together. As they ruled France, Margaret and Louis built a partnership that would define their legacy for generations to come. Despite the trials of the Crusades, Margaret remained a constant figure of strength and grace. Her role as queen was not without its challenges, but she faced them with resilience. The kingdom she ruled alongside Louis was one of great power, but also one of deep faith. Margaret, ever the devoted queen, worked tirelessly to ensure that the legacy of her husband, the sainted Louis IX, would live on. Their marriage, once born of political necessity, had transformed into a deep and enduring partnership. Together, they would face the trials of kingship, and together they would leave a mark on history that would be remembered for centuries to come. The struggles they endured would be immortalized, and the love that grew between them, though born of duty, would be forever cherished in the annals of history. Louis IX's return from the Seventh Crusade marked a turning point. not just for the Kingdom of France, but for his marriage to Margaret. While the crusade had deeply scarred both the king and his kingdom, it also forged a stronger bond between the two rulers. Their reign, however, was far from a peaceful one. They would face both internal and external threats, political turmoil, and personal challenges that would test their faith, their resolve, and their ability to rule. Margaret had spent long years managing the court and the kingdom in her husband's absence. But now, she found herself adapting to a new role. Louis returned with a newfound fervor for his faith, a man transformed by the trials of the crusade. He believed more strongly than ever in his divine calling as king. This devotion, though admirable, created a distance between him and Margaret. The king's preoccupation with piety and his focus on religious matters often left Margaret with little influence over the kingdom's affairs. As Louis's fervent religious convictions grew, so did the tension between them. Margaret was a woman of intelligence and practicality, aware that her husband's unyielding faith and his preoccupation with spiritual matters often put the kingdom in precarious situations. Yet, she understood the delicate balance she had to maintain. Louis was not only her husband, but the King of France, and the kingdom needed him to remain steadfast in his faith. The question that lingered in Margaret's mind was how she could help guide Louis without overstepping her bounds. She had seen firsthand the influence of powerful queens, such as Eleanor of Aquitaine, who had played pivotal roles in the affairs of their countries. Margaret, however, was not Eleanor. She was a different kind of queen, one whose power lay not in politics, but in the quiet strength of her faith and her steadfast devotion to her husband and kingdom. The years following Louis's return from the Crusades were marked by a growing tension between the demands of the crown and the realities of the political landscape. The kingdom was not as stable as it appeared on the surface. There were internal factions, noble families vying for power, and external threats, particularly from the English, who had long claimed lands in France. In this uncertain climate, Margaret stood by Louis, offering her advice and counsel when needed. She knew that the survival of their reign depended not only on their unity as a couple, but also on their ability to navigate the complex web of alliances and enmities that surrounded them. Louis IX, though pious, was also a man of action. He made several important decisions in the years following his return, including legal reforms and attempts to strengthen the central authority of the monarchy. Margaret, though not directly involved in the political decisions, had a role in supporting these reforms. She attended royal councils, spoke with advisors, and helped maintain stability within the kingdom. But even as she played an active role behind the scenes, the rift between her and Louis began to grow wider. Louis's increasing religious devotion led him to embark on a series of ambitious projects, including the construction of Sainte-Chapelle, a magnificent Gothic chapel that would house the relics of the Passion of Christ. This endeavor, which was both a spiritual and political statement, consumed much of Louis's attention and energy. Margaret, for her part, supported the project, but she could not ignore the growing sense of isolation she felt in her marriage. Louis's single-minded devotion to his mission left little room for personal connection. Margaret understood the significance of his religious pursuits, but she also longed for the companionship they had once shared. The years passed in a mixture of religious devotion, political maneuvering, and personal reflection. Margaret's role as queen continued to evolve. She was no longer just the young bride who had arrived in France years earlier. She had grown into a queen who understood the complexities of governance and the responsibilities that came with her position. Margaret became more involved in charitable works, visiting hospitals, supporting the poor, and championing causes that aligned with her faith, though her influence at court remained secondary to Louis's religious agenda. Margaret's quiet strength and her unwavering commitment to her people earned her the respect of the court. In 1248, Louis IX embarked on another crusade, the Eighth Crusade, this time to Tunis in North Africa. It was a decision that would ultimately prove to be his undoing. Margaret, who had already endured the painful separation caused by the Seventh Crusade, faced the prospect of losing her husband once again. But this time, there was a sense of finality. Louis's health had already been compromised by the hardships of the previous crusade, and Margaret feared for his safety. Yet, despite her misgivings, she did not attempt to dissuade him. The king's determination to continue his holy mission was unshakable, and Margaret knew that his faith would always come first. As Louis set sail for Tunis, Margaret remained in France, bearing the weight of the kingdom on her shoulders once again. She ruled with a steady hand, overseeing the affairs of state and ensuring that the kingdom remained stable during the absence of its monarch. But the sense of unease grew as news of the crusade reached her. Louis's health deteriorated rapidly after he landed in Tunis, and the reports from the front lines were grim. Margaret knew that time was running out for her husband. In August 1250, Louis IX succumbed to disease in Tunis, leaving Margaret a widow at the age of 29. The loss of her husband was a devastating blow, not just to Margaret personally, but to the Kingdom of France. Louis's death marked the end of an era, and the entire French court mourned the passing of a king who had been seen as a saint in life. Louis IX was canonized as a saint in 1297, but for Margaret, the saintly aura surrounding her husband was little comfort in her grief. She had lost not just her husband, but her partner in the delicate dance of royal governance. With Louis's death, Margaret was left to navigate the uncertain waters of widowhood and the challenges of ruling as a queen without her king. The regency was entrusted to her son, the future Philip III, who was still a young boy at the time. Margaret took on the role of a mother and protector of her son, guiding him through the early years of his reign. She also ensured that Louis's vision for the kingdom was maintained, working with the royal council to preserve his legacy. While she had once been in the shadow of her husband's devotion, now Margaret stood as a figure of strength in her own right, a woman who had survived the trials of her marriage and the loss of her beloved king. The years following Louis IX's death were marked by a period of transition for the French monarchy. Margaret, as Queen Mother, played a crucial role in the early years of Philip III's reign. She worked closely with the regents and the council to maintain the stability of the kingdom. Margaret's influence during this time was significant, and she was regarded as a wise and capable leader, though she had never been the dominant force at court during Louis's reign. She now found herself at the helm of the French monarchy, guiding her son through the challenges that lay ahead. In her later years, Margaret retired to a quieter life, but she continued to be involved in the affairs of the kingdom. She founded several religious institutions, including monasteries and hospitals, in honor of her late husband's piety. Margaret's legacy was one of strength, faith, and dedication to her people. While she was not the political powerhouse that some queens of her time had been, her quiet influence and steadfast leadership had helped ensure the survival of the Capetian dynasty through turbulent times. Margaret of Provence, once a young girl caught in the political machinations of marriage, had grown into a queen whose influence extended beyond the confines of her royal title. Through the trials of her marriage, the hardships of widowhood, and the challenges of ruling a kingdom, Margaret had proven herself to be a queen in every sense of the word. Her legacy would live on, not just in the history books, but in the hearts of the people she had served so faithfully. The year 1250 marked a significant turning point in Margaret of Provence's life. The death of her beloved husband, Louis IX, left an irreplaceable void in her life and the kingdom. But in the wake of his death, Margaret found herself taking on new roles as a mother, a regent, and a guardian of the legacy Louis had left behind. She was no longer simply the Queen of France. She had become a queen mother, a figure whose influence would extend far beyond the walls of the royal palace. Her reign as regent would test not only her resolve, but also her ability to protect her son's throne while navigating the complex political landscape of 13th century France. With Louis IX gone, the throne was now to be inherited by their son, the young Louis III, who had only recently turned 10 years old. While the Capetian dynasty was relatively stable, the transition of power was never without its challenges. The loss of a revered monarch like Louis IX also left the kingdom vulnerable to internal dissent and external threats. As the new regent, Margaret was tasked with guiding the kingdom through this delicate period, all while trying to shield her son from the ruthless machinations of ambitious courtiers and noble factions. Margaret's task was no small feat. The political landscape in France was in turmoil. Although Louis IX had been a pious and revered king, his absence left a power vacuum that some sought to exploit. In addition to this internal instability, France still faced threats from England. King Henry III of England, who had long laid claim to French territories, presented a serious challenge to the Capetian crown. Margaret's role as regent thus became one of balancing diplomacy, military strategy, and the preservation of the royal lineage. Louis III, such a young age, was still very much under his mother's influence. Although he would eventually take the reins of power, Margaret's control over the throne was crucial in the early years of his reign. As regent, Margaret worked tirelessly to preserve the stability of the kingdom. She gathered counsel from the nobility and high-ranking members of the court, carefully weighing decisions that would have a lasting impact on the kingdom. Her most trusted advisors, including the influential figures of the French court, were vital in this transition period. One of the most challenging issues Margaret faced was the ongoing conflict with England. The English king, Henry III, had not forgotten the territorial disputes that had plagued his relationship with France. In the years following Louis IX's death, tensions continued to rise, with the Kingdom of France still reeling from the death of its beloved king. Margaret had to navigate the delicate balance between diplomacy and war. She sought to forge alliances with other European powers, including the Holy Roman Empire, in a bid to strengthen France's position against England. Yet, despite her political acumen, Margaret's position was often precarious. The French court was rife with factions, each vying for influence over the young king. Her own family members, including her brother, Charles of Anjou, were eager to secure their own political gains in the wake of Louis IX's death. Charles, who had been a powerful force in Italy, was a man of ambition. His actions, at times, put him at odds with Margaret's vision for a stable and united France. While she sought to maintain the integrity of the monarchy, Charles sought to use his influence over the young Louis III for his own benefit. This internal conflict between Margaret and her brother was one of the key struggles during her regency. Margaret, however, was not without her supporters. The court had respect for her, and her reign as regent was marked by her devotion to the welfare of the kingdom. She worked to preserve the traditions and values that had defined France under her late husband. The Queen Mother also found strength in her faith, often attending religious services and supporting charitable causes throughout the kingdom. Her support of the church helped her maintain influence with the clergy, who were key players in the political sphere of medieval France. The years following Louis IX's death also saw Margaret solidify her role as a mother to Louis III. The young king was still in his formative years, and Margaret knew that his success would depend largely on her guidance. As his regent, she aimed to instill in him the virtues that had defined his father's reign: piety, justice, and a commitment to the well-being of the people. Margaret's devotion to her son was evident in the way she shaped his education and the advice she offered him. She wanted to ensure that Louis III would grow into a king who would earn the respect and admiration of his people, just as his father had. But Margaret's influence was not solely confined to the court. Her own family, particularly her sister Beatrice of Savoy, played an important role in the politics of France. Beatrice, a shrewd and capable woman, often advised Margaret during times of political uncertainty. Margaret's sister had been a trusted ally, and her support was invaluable during these years of transition. Beatrice's political insight, combined with Margaret's natural ability to navigate the intricacies of royal diplomacy, helped guide France through the challenges that arose in the years following Louis IX's death. Despite Margaret's efforts to preserve the stability of the kingdom, the political landscape continued to evolve. In 1265, Margaret's son Louis III officially came of age and assumed control of the throne. The young king, now a man, took over the responsibilities of ruling France, while Margaret's role as regent officially ended. Her influence on her son's reign continued. She remained an advisor and a key figure in the royal court, offering her wisdom and counsel whenever needed. Her legacy as a queen and queen mother was far from over. As the years went on, Margaret's status remained unshaken, and her position as a mother and protector of the monarchy continued to shape the direction of France. But Margaret's life was not without its personal challenges. The loss of Louis IX had left a deep emotional scar, one that never truly healed. The man she had loved, the king who had shared her life and her faith, was gone, and Margaret was left to carry the weight of both their legacy and the future of their kingdom. It was a burden that she bore with grace, but it was not without its toll. As she grew older, Margaret became more reflective, often seeking solace in prayer and spiritual contemplation. Her devotion to God, a characteristic she had shared with her late husband, became a cornerstone of her life in her later years. Throughout her life, Margaret had witnessed the rise and fall of many powerful figures. She had seen her own family members rise to prominence, and she had watched others fall from grace. She had lived through times of great political upheaval, and yet, through it all, she had remained a constant presence in the court of France. As the years passed, Margaret's legacy only grew more solidified. She became a symbol of maternal strength, a queen who had endured immense hardship but had never wavered in her commitment to her family and her kingdom. Margaret of Provence's later years were marked by a quieter life, though she continued to be an influential figure in French politics. She became deeply involved in religious life, founding several monasteries and charitable institutions throughout the kingdom. Her devotion to her faith never faltered, and she remained a deeply respected figure in the French court. The Queen Mother lived long enough to witness the reigns of her sons, Louis III and Philip IV, and her influence was still felt in the court for many years. In the end, Margaret of Provence's legacy was not just one of political maneuvering or royal intrigue. It was a legacy built on devotion, perseverance, and faith. She had been a queen, a wife, a mother, and a protector of her kingdom. And in the end, Margaret was remembered not just for her role in the political affairs of France, but for her steadfast loyalty to her family and her unwavering faith, both of which had defined her life from the very beginning. Margaret of Provence had lived through a tumultuous period in French history, from the reign of Louis IX to the transition of power under her son Louis III, and beyond. Yet, as the years went on and her role as a regent came to an end, her legacy did not fade. Instead, it became even more ingrained in the history of the Capetian dynasty and the kingdom she had helped sustain. In the year 1265, when her son Philip officially ascended to the throne as Louis III, Margaret's influence was still deeply felt. The young king, now a man of 20, was faced with challenges that his mother had so carefully tried to mitigate during her regency. As the newly crowned monarch, Louis III had to navigate a complicated political landscape, balancing the interests of the nobility, the church, and the growing merchant class. Margaret, ever the political strategist, remained at his side, though now more as a trusted advisor than as an active ruler. Margaret's presence at court was both revered and respected. Her role as a queen mother was no longer one of active regency, but she was still a key figure in the royal court. The respect she commanded was rooted not only in her status as the widow of a saintly king, but also in her deep understanding of the intricacies of court politics. As a woman who had been both a queen and a mother, Margaret possessed the wisdom and experience that no amount of education or ambition could replicate. Her advice to Louis III was sought on matters ranging from diplomacy to military strategy. And though her influence was often subtle, it was nonetheless significant. The first years of Louis III's reign were marked by political challenges both from within and outside the kingdom. France, though still one of the most powerful nations in Europe, faced threats from England, the Holy Roman Empire, and various regional powers. The Hundred Years' War was still far in the future, but Margaret could see the growing tensions between England and France. The young king, though well-meaning, lacked the experience to fully understand the complexities of foreign diplomacy and military tactics. Margaret's wisdom, drawn from years of experience in navigating the challenges of royal rule, helped guide her son through these turbulent waters. One of the most significant challenges during Louis III's early reign was the ongoing conflict with England. King Edward I of England, a formidable ruler, was determined to assert England's claims over French territory. The English and French monarchs had long been in conflict over territories in the south of France, and Edward I's ambitions only escalated during the first years of Louis III's reign. Margaret, ever the diplomat, sought to maintain peace with England while still preserving the sovereignty of France. She understood the importance of alliances and sought to strengthen ties with neighboring powers, including the Holy Roman Empire, Castile, and Aragon. Margaret's efforts to secure peace were not always successful. However, in 1270, after a period of tense negotiations, Louis III embarked on a military campaign to reclaim the territories in the south of France that had long been disputed. Margaret, though deeply saddened by her son's decision to go to war, understood that it was necessary to preserve France's power and influence. She stood by him, offering her advice on military strategy and providing emotional support as the campaign unfolded. The war, however, was far from straightforward. The forces of Louis III clashed with those of Edward I, and the conflict escalated into a series of bloody skirmishes along the border. The outcome of these battles would shape the future of the Capetian dynasty, and Margaret's role in advising her son remained crucial during this time. She continued to monitor the progress of the war from the royal court, offering counsel on military tactics and logistics. Despite the challenges of war, Margaret remained a stabilizing force in the kingdom, ensuring that the nobility and court remained loyal to her son, even as the military situation became more complicated. While her son was away at war, Margaret faced the ever-present challenge of holding the court together. She continued to oversee the affairs of the royal household, managing the complex web of relationships between the nobility, the clergy, and the court officials. She was a master of diplomacy and political negotiation, and her ability to mediate conflicts within the court ensured that France remained united in the face of external threats. Margaret's role was also central in the administration of France's vast territories. She worked to ensure that the crown's interests were protected in all corners of the kingdom, balancing the demands of the regional lords with the central authority of the monarchy. One of the most important events during this time was the appointment of Charles of Anjou, Margaret's brother, as the King of Sicily. This was a pivotal moment in the history of the Capetian dynasty, as Charles's ambitions would have far-reaching consequences for both France and Italy. Charles had long sought to expand his influence in the Mediterranean, and his appointment as King of Sicily opened the door for a series of conflicts and alliances that would shape the future of Europe. Margaret, though she had long been a supporter of her brother, was wary of his growing power. She understood the potential for internal conflict, especially given the increasingly strained relationship between Charles and Louis III. She carefully navigated her role as mediator, attempting to balance the competing interests of her family and her country. As the years passed, Margaret's role in the court of Louis III began to shift. While she remained a powerful figure, her health began to decline. She had always been a woman of great strength, but the years had taken their toll. Margaret's once vibrant presence in the royal court began to fade, and she retreated from the political scene to focus on her family and her faith. She spent more time in prayer, seeking solace in the spiritual life that had always been a cornerstone of her existence. Despite her physical decline, Margaret's influence on her son remained strong. Louis III, now fully in control of the throne, continued to seek his mother's counsel. Margaret's advice, rooted in the experience of a lifetime spent navigating the complexities of royal rule, remained invaluable, even as her health worsened. she continued to guide her son through the challenges of kingship. Her legacy, built on the foundation of her reign as regent, continued to shape the future of France. Margaret of Provence's final years were spent in relative quiet, as she withdrew from the political scene and focused on her spiritual well-being. In 1295, after a life filled with political intrigue, military campaigns, and the responsibilities of motherhood, Margaret passed away at the age of 64. She was mourned deeply by the people of France, who saw her as a symbol of maternal devotion, strength, and resilience. Her death marked the end of an era for the Capetian dynasty, but her legacy would endure through her children and the kingdom she had helped shape. In the aftermath of her death, Margaret's legacy continued to influence the course of French history. Louis III, who had been guided by her wisdom throughout his reign, would pass the throne on to his son, Philip IV, a king whose rule would be marked by both triumphs and challenges. The influence of Margaret of Provence, though no longer a physical presence at court, remained a guiding force in the kingdom. Margaret's life, though not as well remembered as that of her husband Louis IX, was one of quiet strength and steadfast devotion. She had been a queen, a mother, and a regent, but more than that, she had been a protector of the Capetian dynasty and the Kingdom of France. Her story, filled with political struggles, family drama, and spiritual devotion, was one that shaped the course of French history in ways both seen and unseen. Margaret of Provence's passing in 1295 left a profound mark on the Kingdom of France, an impact that reverberated through the halls of the royal court and throughout the monarchy itself. Having guided her son Louis III with both wisdom and maternal devotion, Margaret's death signaled the end of an era where a queen mother's influence and steady counsel played an indispensable role in the stability of the French throne. The kingdom, while vast and powerful, was now to navigate its future without the steady hand that had once steered it through some of its most turbulent times. For Louis III, the loss was personal and political, though he had ascended to the throne as a young man. The years of regency under his mother had imbued him with a sense of responsibility and leadership that was vital for a king to rule. As his reign progressed, it became clear that he, though a monarch in his own right, was shaped by his mother's decisions, her foresight, and her ability to understand the intricate workings of both the kingdom and the court. Her death left a vacuum, one that no advisor could fill so seamlessly as Margaret had done. For Louis III, the grief of losing his mother was compounded by the recognition that the mantle of leadership he now wore was one of immense weight. Margaret had ruled from behind the scenes, yet her impact was felt in every aspect of court life. She had been a master of diplomacy, always one step ahead in the game of thrones and treaties, maneuvering through the tangled web of noble rivalries and international conflicts. She knew how to balance the often competing interests of the church, the crown, and the nobility. Under her watch, France had been stable, unified, and powerful. Now, in the wake of her death, France's challenges would become increasingly apparent. For one, the threat from England loomed larger than ever. Edward I, King of England, had always been a thorn in the side of the French monarchy, with territorial disputes brewing ever since the reign of King Henry III of England. The conflict over lands in the south of France, coupled with the ongoing rivalry over the English throne's claims to French territories, had been a persistent headache during Louis III's reign. Margaret's diplomatic tact had, on many occasions, prevented the escalation of full-scale war. But now, without her to act as an intermediary, tensions with England flared anew. Louis III, though capable, was not the master of diplomacy his mother had been. With Margaret gone, it was up to him to handle the growing conflict and, ultimately, the consequences of war with England. The political landscape within France itself was also shifting. Under Margaret's watch, she had worked tirelessly to consolidate the monarchy's power in the hands of her son. She had balanced the interests of the nobility, ensuring that no one faction became too powerful, while maintaining the delicate unity of the crown. But her death left a gap that threatened to unravel the stability she had so carefully crafted. Louis III was now the sole ruler, but he lacked the ability to fully manage the complexity of court politics without his mother's steady guidance. The nobles, ever hungry for more influence and power, began to make their moves, taking advantage of the king's perceived weakness in the face of his mother's absence. Still, Margaret's legacy endured in the decisions Louis III made during the critical years following her death. He sought to continue the policies of peace and diplomacy that she had favored, especially in matters involving the Holy Roman Empire. Her careful management of the kingdom's alliances had ensured France's position as a key player in European politics, and Philip continued to rely on the principles of diplomacy to secure the monarchy's position. Though Louis III was not as politically adept as Margaret, his desire to maintain France's influence in the world was still guided by the lessons she had imparted to him. But even as the kingdom faced external threats and internal tensions, the death of Margaret of Provence did not go unnoticed by the people of France. The Queen Mother had been a symbol of strength, of stability, and of unwavering devotion to her family and her country. Her role as a queen, a mother, and a regent had solidified her place in the history of France, and her passing was felt by all. Her legacy as a wise and capable ruler had helped guide the Capetian dynasty to its greatest heights. And even in death, she remained a figure of reverence in the eyes of the people. As Philip IV, the son of Margaret and Louis III, ascended to the throne, the legacy of his mother's influence only became more apparent. Philip IV, known later as Philip the Fair, was a monarch of a different character. Whereas his father had sought to preserve the kingdom through diplomacy and cautious statecraft, Philip IV was bold, aggressive, and determined to centralize power. He faced new challenges, both within his own court and in the greater European arena. But despite the differences in style between Louis III and Philip IV, Margaret's influence remained a constant. Her lessons in the art of diplomacy, her understanding of the balance between power and pragmatism, had been passed down to her son, and these lessons would shape the policies of the French crown for generations to come. Philip IV's reign would mark the beginning of a new chapter for France, one characterized by the consolidation of royal authority, the expansion of the monarchy's influence over the French nobility, and the strengthening of France's position in Europe. But it was also a reign marked by internal strife, especially in his conflicts with the papacy and the nobility. These struggles would define his rule, even as he sought to maintain the grandeur of the Capetian dynasty. The future of France, in many ways, was being shaped by the legacy of Margaret of Provence. Though her name would be forgotten by some, her influence would remain a part of the fabric of French governance. Margaret's final years, though largely spent in quiet reflection, had set the stage for the future of France. Her wisdom, her political acumen, and her devotion to her family had been the cornerstone of her success as a queen. She had navigated the complexities of court life with grace, ensuring that her children were prepared to take on the mantle of leadership when the time came. Even as she withdrew from the public eye in her later years, her legacy lived on, a beacon for those who would come after her. Her death marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of a new one. A new generation of rulers would rise to power, but they would do so with the knowledge that the strength of the monarchy rested on the lessons of those who had come before them. Margaret of Provence, though no longer present in the halls of the royal court, continued to influence the course of French history, her legacy a testament to the enduring power of a mother's love, a queen's strength, and a ruler's wisdom. The history of France would not be the same without her. And though her name may not have been immortalized in the same way as that of her sainted husband, Louis IX, or her powerful son, Philip IV, Margaret's legacy as the Queen Mother, as a guardian of the French crown, would continue to echo through the corridors of time. It was not just her political prowess that defined her, but her devotion to the people she loved, her children, and the kingdom she worked so hard to preserve. Her legacy lived on, in the courts of Philip IV and beyond, as France continued to evolve, driven by the foundation that Margaret of Provence had helped lay. As the Capetian dynasty continued its long and illustrious reign, Margaret's contributions, both seen and unseen, would remain an indelible part of the tapestry of French history. Her final years, marked by a quiet yet profound sense of duty, were the culmination of a life that had been defined by her strength, intelligence, and unwavering loyalty to her family and country.